What's up, guys? Welcome back to another Monday night. Thanks so much again for joining. Those of you telling me that the audio is not working, I don't believe you because you're all jumping the gun. We haven't even gone live yet. There we go. You should have sound, you should have video, you should see me and hear me, so we're good to go. Thank you very much. Yes, I've had a haircut. You'll notice that, those who saw the video from last Friday, because it featured in that. But look, no race this weekend, of course. I hope you all had a decent weekend off or managed to do something that wasn't Formula One. Or did you manage to find something Formula One related to fill in the non-Formula One weekend? Let me know. But anyway, even though there was no Grand Prix, there's still loads to talk about, as there always is, because the story's bubbling away in the background all the way through. So we're going to get into as many of those as we can over the next hour. So thanks for joining in. Thank you to those of me commenting on my hair. Thanks very much. Hello to DJ Wizzle from Jamaica. Big shout to you guys. David Xavier from Toronto. Hello there. Free to Wheel down in Goodwood. Minko Sumas in the Netherlands. Thank you very much. Varun Sambi, I know you're a regular, so welcome back. Thank you very much. It's not a wig, I promise you. Right, are we saying we've got a problem with the chat? The chat's been dropping in and out, so hopefully it will catch up with itself, but let's keep going anyway. Keep your comments coming in. They're all flashing up on my screen, so hopefully that's all good. We're going to start things off by looking at a question that Thomas Blay sent in. In fact, it wasn't just Thomas Blay, it was loads of you. So thank you very much for talking about this. It's the title of the video. It's the main topic on most people's lips, which is this one. George Russell. Thomas Blay says, what are your thoughts on the rumour that George is going to be dropped by Williams in favour of Sergio for 2021? It seems like an unthinkable thing to happen to one of Formula One's brightest young talents that's not put a foot wrong, really, in the most part, in his first couple of years in the sport. He seems to be a driver that's on the rise with probably some sort of destiny that may well see him at the main Mercedes team at some stage. And yet there are now rumours that he may well be out of a seat for next season. Now, these are rumours, so I don't know. I have no inside information, I'm afraid to say, on this, but then I don't think many people do. There's lots of internet speculation, as with everything on here, but let's look at the pros and cons of this, or the reasons why it might be happening. And there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, of course, Sergio comes with a huge amount of money. We know he's available, we know he's a decent driver. If Williams, in their new situation with their new owners, we don't really know the financial situation of the team. Yes, they've invested heavily in buying it and taking it on. They know that it's an expensive sport. So we can assume that they're in a better financial state than perhaps Williams were before. And yet Williams didn't see the need to take on two paying drivers. Yes, they've got one in Latifi, of course, but they've got George Russell, who we know is a bright star, bright talent. So they could be looking for extra funds. I find that one slightly unlikely. I'm not saying that's the only good thing about Sergio Perez, because he comes with a huge amount of talent, but also experience as well. But he also comes with a huge amount of money, and that can't be overlooked, particularly for a team like Williams. So there is a possibility. That's one of the things that's fairly high up their priority list. The other is that these new owners of Williams have come in, and they're not in this for a quick buck. They're in it for the short term. They're looking to build or rebuild a team that has a huge history in the sport. Now, if they're looking to rebuild a team, can they do that with George Russell, given that they know he's only there as a stopgap before going on towards Mercedes, or at least somewhere further up the grid? They can't keep hold of George Russell for very long. They've done well to hang on to him for this long. And actually, Claire Williams activating that clause in George's contract to keep him for next year, which will be a third year, has ruffled a number of feathers. I think it's upset George. I think it's possibly upset Mercedes to some extent. And yet they've managed to hang on to him. So they know they're not going to hang on to him for longer than that. So if they're looking to build something longer term, they need to find an alternate solution to George Russell. Whilst he's a great driver, perhaps somebody like a Sergio Perez, who may not have the longest of careers ahead of him, he's still got a fair amount of time, and he already comes with a wealth of experience. So potentially Sergio Perez is a decent fit for Williams in that regard. It just feels so unfair that George Russell, if you believe the rumours, could get elbowed out. Now, these are rumours, as I say, so none of this may come to fruition, and George may well keep his contracted seat and see out the remainder of his contract at Williams. I think that's probably the most likely scenario in all of this. But let's say that George Russell does get shafted and get sent packing from Williams. Well, what happens then? He can't really walk into a Mercedes seat. Both of those are taken. I know, well, we say both of those are taken. Lewis Hamilton hasn't yet signed a contract, so bear that in mind. Although we fully expect, I guess, that to happen at some point soon. So George Russell could face a year on the sidelines potentially, where you would imagine be embedded in the Mercedes team as a simulator driver, as a test driver, as a reserve driver. And given that we're in this current situation with a global pandemic, a reserve driver now becomes an even more important prospect than it might have been before, with a view to maybe taking Bottas's seat with a year alongside Lewis Hamilton, maybe before Lewis retires or moves on to something else, who knows. But that would be a really great trajectory for George Russell to be on. It's just that missing out on a year's worth of racing, well, he will hate that, and it's really not a great situation for anybody's racing career, let's be honest. So I'd love to know what you think on this. If these rumours come true, if George loses his Williams seat, do you think there might be some silver lining for George in that he's free of that Williams contract, he can start working and learning from the Mercedes team? Or is it just really bad news for him where he needs to be on the grid, he needs to be driving, he needs to be racing, showing what he can do in front of the world to keep his career prospects, I guess, alive? Ryan Collins says that Russell will replace Hamilton as he announces his retirement. There's no way that Lewis Hamilton is going to announce his retirement before taking that title, that all-time record of potentially 7, potentially 8 world championships. There's no way that's going to happen to Lewis, is there? George Russell to Formula E. I don't think that's going to happen. I think he's got a bright future in Formula 1, and I think he knows that. The Mercedes team know that to some extent, and he will have all eyes on making his way to the finest car in Formula 1, I'm sure. Russell to Bottas seat, says Fire Up. Now, Bottas, of course, we now know has signed a contract for a year. There's not really any incentive for Mercedes to, because of course you could buy Valtteri out of his contract, you could pay him off for the year if you really wanted to get George in the car, but A, that's very expensive to do, and does that really what Mercedes want? We've talked on here loads of times that actually Valtteri's doing probably the perfect job for Mercedes, isn't he? He's pretty much coming home second behind Lewis most times. He's doing enough to secure the Constructors' Championship year on year. That's what Mercedes want. They don't want anyone upsetting the Lewis Hamilton train en route to this world record breaking number of titles, for which Mercedes will also benefit when Lewis does that. They can't have that being upset because the opportunity just won't come around for very often. Let's see, just look at Ocon, exactly. So Mosh says just look at Ocon in reference to what happens to a driver when he has a year out. Now, I'm not saying the year out is exactly why Ocon's not performing to the same level that we might have expected him to, but it's not good for a driver to sit on the sidelines, absolutely. What about Russell to Red Bull? Well, in order for that to happen, because that would be a mouth-watering prospect, wouldn't it? George Russell alongside Max. In order for that to happen, of course, he needs to escape his Mercedes contract, which he has, to be able to do that. So he would have to have the permission of Mercedes to be let go and to join one of their main rivals. Now, Mercedes really going to do that? They've got George Russell lining up in the wings as a potential Lewis Hamilton replacement. The star of their future, maybe. Do they really want to let him go? I can't see that happening myself. I just can't see it, although it would be great. Alonso had a year out, says Sandra Reynolds. He did have a year out. In fact, he's had a couple of years out, hasn't he? It'd be interesting to see what happens when he comes back, that's for sure. Right, let's move it on. I know the chat seems to be freezing a little bit. That's at YouTube's end rather than my end, so there's nothing I can do about it. It's fine on my screen, so I can still see all of your comments, so do keep them coming. I'm reading them all as they come around. Bobby Moore, 93, says, Mark, do you miss being around Lewis and race day? Do I miss being around Lewis? Well, it was a long time since I've been hanging around with Lewis. What I definitely miss and what I take from working with Lewis, and I still benefit from this today, is I do see him as an inspirational character. There's lots of things about Lewis that I'm not going to take into my own life. He's a unique character in many ways as well, but his drive, his work ethic and his drive for success is something that I think everybody who's ever worked with him, feeds off. And I take that as a massive positive. Because, I see people like that, Lewis and others in the world of sport and business and every industry. There are people that are always striving for success. I don't know if you ever saw the Michael Jordan documentary on Netflix. Amazing. You've got to check that out if you haven't seen it. One of the best sports documentaries I've seen. But the thing I took from it was he was another one of those characters where he was the greatest basketball player of his generation by miles, you could say. And yet he still was the guy that worked hardest in training, that worked hardest and was most dedicated in getting the best out of his team. And to some extent, that's Lewis. So I do miss seeing that on a daily basis. Do I miss race day? I do miss race day. That's the one part of being in a Formula One team. I miss the pit stops, if I'm really honest, and the feeling of winning, which I was very lucky enough to have a lot, because it's the biggest adrenaline buzz you can have. And, not everybody's lucky enough to experience that winning feeling in Formula One. And having had it, you want more of it. It becomes utterly addictive. So, yeah, I miss that side of it. But on the flip side, I love what I do now. So I'm very, very happy that I don't need that anymore in my life. I've done it. I've ticked the box. Very happy with what I achieved and what we achieved as a team through that period. Now I'm loving what I do today. So I've been a very lucky man in that sense in my career. Let me see. Marc, do you miss working and being next to Kimi though? Good old times. Well, I do miss that for very different reasons. We had a proper laugh with Kimi. You may have seen the video I did, the Tales from the Treehouse I did this week, which was about Kimi winning that Suzuka 2005 race. And what came off the back of that was one of the biggest celebrations that I've ever experienced in any of my Formula One career or even outside it. It was a proper 3-day bender that kind of took in 2 countries, 3 days. I think I ended up with a verbal written warning from the team at the end of it. We almost got kicked out of a hotel as a result, direct result of that celebration. So yeah, I miss being with Kimi. Right, let's move it on. Do you miss dyeing people blue? I do. I've got some great pictures of not just Kimi, but some of the people in the team that have been dyed blue, and some of the things that we did to people when they left. Horrific. Anyway, let's move it on. Let's move it on because I've got more questions. So let's see what else we've got here. Oh yeah, this one from Mario was a good one. Why would Marc stop developing the 2020 car if the rules stay quite the same in 2021? It makes no sense to me. Well, Mario, so this comes from the fact that Toto Wolff just last week kind of announced or said in an interview that they'd stopped developing this year's car some time ago. So they got what they got, and they're going to see the season out so they can focus on 2021. Well, yes, there are a number of rules in place that say a huge part of this year's car will carry over to next year. But the thing that isn't restricted in that regulation is the aero surfaces. So that's every surface of bodywork, wings. And don't forget, we've got a huge change coming in 2021 with the floor. I talked about this last week. In fact, I think I've still got a picture on here. I have. Oh no, I haven't. I took it off. I had a picture of the floor for next year, which has got this huge cutout trailing inwards towards the rear tyres. So from the front of the floor, the leading edge of the floor, the car now tapers inwards towards the inside of the rear tyres for next year. We're losing a huge chunk of floor. The reason for that is to slow the cars down because we lose a huge chunk of downforce as a result. But what that means is that the teams have to kind of completely redesign their aero concept around that, because those floor sections in front of the rear tyres today are a huge part of where the sealing of the diffuser happens, and that's where you get most of your downforce from the underside of the car, particularly on some teams like the high rake cars, again, that we talked about last week. A lot of the controlling of the tyre squirt, so that's the airflow that squirts out as the rolling tyre makes contact with the road surface. it squirts out kind of jets or blasts of airflow in all sorts of directions as the rolling tyre hits the tarmac, as it meets the tarmac. And there's little slots around the front of that, or the rear of the floor there, that control all of that and still protect the diffuser, sealing that off, stopping those wayward jets of airflow disappearing into the diffuser and minimising its effect. We lose all of those for next year. So that's a huge part of the way the aero works on a 2020 car. So actually the 2021 cars are going to look very different to the 2020 cars. And that's why Toto's saying that essentially they've switched all focus onto next year, which is actually a significant change compared to this year. So you'll see them looking very different in many ways, but even the things you can't necessarily see that clearly will have a very different design concept put into them. The bargeboard area will be very different. The front of the floor section will be very different. Even the front wing will have to work in a different way because it can't feed the floor in the way that it does this year. So everything changes off the back of these little design changes or regulation changes that are coming in for next year. So there's a huge focus being switched by most of the teams, but mostly at of course Mercedes, who had this huge advantage knowing they didn't really have to develop their way all the way through the season because they had no competition. So they'll still bring small updates, I have no doubt. They'll have had updates that have been planned, but the main conceptual change will already be well underway for 2021. And of course, don't forget, they've still got some tokens that they're able to spend in terms of development tokens. So some development can still happen within the regulations, but the aero surface and the aero design concept, well, that will have a huge amount of work and resource being thrown onto next year's car already. By Mercedes, probably by some other teams too. That number of people working on it will just grow and grow and grow as the season goes on towards the tail end of the championship. That's how it normally works. Right, let me see what you're saying here. Bring back the V8. Yeah, classic. Let me see. So yes, I can see a little chat going on up there about why we're shaving that floor section down and minimising the downforce. It is, as somebody has rightly answered there, because we're using the tyres that were originally designed 2 years ago, and because we were originally going to be changing, of course, to the 18-inch rims, don't forget, when the new regulations, which were originally destined to come in this year. So back in 2018, Pirelli designed a tyre they were only going to use for 1 year. Then we pushed the regulations back, so they said, okay, well, we'll use that tyre for a second year. And now we've pushed the regulations back again. And Pirelli don't want to, or can't really afford, to commit a huge amount of resource developing a new tyre, given that the cars are staying relatively similar, or they were in the beginning, despite what I've just said, with all the changes that are coming. So we've now got a tyre that by next year will be on its third season, and car development has moved on so much that downforce and therefore speeds and therefore loads through those tyres have increased to such a level that they can't guarantee safety at the rate that teams are developing. So they're shaving that chunk of downforce away. Pirelli are making some changes to tyres, and in fact this weekend at Portimao we're going to get the first half an hour of FP2. All of the teams will be running what Pirelli hope will be next year's tyre, which will be a very slight variation on what we've got this year. So they are going to make some changes, not huge, but they're going to make some changes within the budgets that they have, that they're able to do with ease, and the teams will run that this weekend. So we'll see the first half hour with unmarked tyres on all teams, on all cars. They've all got to do this. This is a mandated thing in the regulations. And Pirelli will run a blind test. So the teams and drivers won't know which tyres they're running at any given moment. Pirelli will determine the run plan. They will then collect all the data and hopefully then be able to sign off the tyre for next year. That is the plan. There we go. So the 2021 rule changes sound expensive, says Daniel Antonov. And that's a really good point, because of course the reason we're pushing 2022 regs, the big regs back, was exactly that, to save money. So the idea was, well, we'll keep these cars because then everyone can save money. And then this concern from Pirelli came in about speeds and tyre integrity, and now they've had to introduce this change to the floor, which on paper looks like a really simple change. The reality is that it will cost a huge amount of money because people will have to develop a very different concept around it. So absolutely. So 18-inch tyres in 2022, that is correct, Cosmos 2017. That's when we'll see those. Of course, they've been running 18-inch tyres on the F2 cars, and therefore Pirelli, who also supply that championship, have gained a huge amount of information on those. They're not the same tyres, but it does help to be able to run those, to learn a lot of things about tyre pressures, tyre temperatures, the way that the warm-up happens on those cars, and they will feed all that information back into the F1 development program. 18-inch tyres are going to be rubbish, says Eric719. I'd like to know why you think that. I'm not sure, you know. In terms of aesthetics, I actually think they look better. It's going to take some getting used to, because we've all known 13-inch big balloon tyres forever, but that's very old-fashioned. And I actually think it's great that we're moving forward with this. I think I've shown them on this channel before, so I think you've seen what they're like. I've got a 2-minute tech video on the reasons why we're changing to 18-inch tyres, because it's not all about aesthetics. There's a big aero reason, so check that video out later if you want to see what's behind the change. But I actually think they'll be okay. The teams will have to adapt the way they design and then operate their suspension around that, because at the moment a lot of the suspension travel is taken up, of course, in the squash of these big balloon tyres. That's going to go. These low profile tyres won't have anywhere near the squash, so that suspension travel has to then be moved to the car's suspension. But from an engineering perspective, that's great for an engineer, because it now falls under your control. You know, you can design the effects of that suspension and control the amount of travel and how it operates much more than you can with a component, a tyre, that you're not designing. And it's just got this huge squash, uncontrolled squash. So the engineers, although it's a huge challenge for them and it will take some time to get the best out of it, I think actually we'll end up loving it. Let me see. 18-inch are good, but free up the rules on suspension. So that's Will White. Free up the rules on suspension. Well, of course, we've got very different cars in when the 18-inch tyres come in. So we've got a whole new set of rules anyway around that sort of stuff. But I do think it's going to be one of these things that develops over time as the teams get their head around this. And don't forget, there's a huge amount to get their head around in 2022. When they get the best, start getting the best out of every area of the car, which will take well over a season. You know, they won't get the best out of them in the first season, but they will eventually, and I think we'll then start to see some really interesting designs around suspension and how to maximise that opportunity, because it is an opportunity. When will the car for the F2 series be updated? I don't know, Varun Sambi. I'm afraid I don't know enough about Formula 2 about their rules, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. Any ideas on a new engine formula for 2025, Daisy Cutter? Not more than we've already discussed, really. It has to be something that's sustainable. We know that. I mean, let's talk about the engines for a moment, because there were some questions, and I don't think I've saved one, but there were some questions about Red Bull wanting to have the engine technology frozen as of next year. They put some request in, didn't they, as you've probably read by now, to try and freeze the engines from 2022 onwards, effectively to allow them to continue to use the Honda engine, even though Honda are leaving. What it would mean would be that Red Bull could take the existing Honda power unit, which would finish at the end of 2021, be developed and be current. And if they froze the rules, of course, they'd be at no disadvantage to be able to continue running that. Well, that's great for Red Bull. Are the other teams going to agree to that? Absolutely not. There is no way I can see that happening. Of course, they're going to argue they're going to do this on cost grounds, but the reality is it's all about Red Bull trying to sort themselves out an easy win or an easy fix for their current engine dilemma. So I can't see that that's going to happen. There's no way that a Mercedes or a Ferrari, especially a Ferrari, are going to agree to freezing the engine regs at the end of 2021. So that's not going to happen. I can't see that. So the new regs for 2025, which is something that, in all honesty, they've really got to come to some sort of conclusion pretty soon, because these things take a few years to come to fruition. because whatever they kind of land on in their discussions now, that won't be the final version. This needs a couple of, well, months, probably a year or years to be fine-tuned into a formula that will actually work. But it's got to be something sustainable. It's most likely to end up now around sustainable fuels is probably going to be the focus, with perhaps an increased hybrid element to the power unit. I would imagine maybe a smaller internal combustion engine. I'm not sure they're going to go as extreme as some people would love to see. I just think they're running out of time, in all honesty. I think that's got to happen pretty quickly. There is a lot of work going on behind the scenes, don't get me wrong, but I would have expected by now, or certainly by 2021, an absolute finite decision. In 4 years' time, this is what we'll be using. We haven't had anything like that yet, so we'll see. We'll see how it goes. Would there be more engine supplies in F1 if they used the four-cylinder hybrid as used in WEC? Well, I think if they'd done that a few years ago, quite possibly, in fact, almost certainly, when they came into this hybrid era in Formula One, if they'd gone down that route, I absolutely think there'd have been more engine supplies. In fact, I think we know that because the likes of Porsche, who went some way down the development path, turned away at that point because Formula One went in a different direction to the way they wanted to go. So I think we definitely would have had that. I think now we need to be looking further into the future. We need to be looking a bit more cutting edge. We need to be, as we talked about before, if we want the auto manufacturers on board, we need to be looking at what they want and what they need to be developing into the future, which could be something quite futuristic. So it's all up in the air at the moment on that one. We will have to wait and see. As soon as we get news, I will share it with you and talk about it more. I've just seen a question. Sandy Barnes, what was your punishment for the Dick Balaclava stunt, if any? Did you see that video? It was called F1. What was it called? F1 Pit Stop Pranks and Parties was the title of the video. I encourage you to check it out because I've watched it a couple of times since. It's still making me laugh, where I utterly pranked my missus with my old pit stop balaclava, and her reaction was priceless. It was just brilliant. Luckily she took it well, although she did call me a dick at least 10 times. But I think I got away with it. Right, let me see. So Andrew Lease says Merc have a lower floor angle that suits the new floor plan design, and that is true. I think we talked about this a bit last week, didn't we? That it will, in theory, hurt the high rake angle cars more than it will the lower cars like a Mercedes or a Racing Point, because the high rake angle, utilises the diffuser more, gets much more out of its, or potentially gets much more out of its diffuser, but therefore you've got a huge gap between the floor and the road surface that needs to be sealed using all of that clever trickery around the edge of the floor's trailing edges. So when we lose that, you would imagine that the teams that need that most or have a much more effective area there are going to get hit hardest, aren't they? Because they're going to lose more effect potentially. So you might start to see a swing in concepts, or people like Red Bull will have to start finding other ways to effectively seal that gap, which I'm sure they'll do, using things like the barge boards and the powerful vortices that can spin up off the front wing or the leading edge of the floor. But it will mean that different design concept. Let me see. McLaren are going towards to being a Merc floor angle concept, says Hakiran Sahota. McLaren do seem to be leading more towards some Mercedes concepts, don't they? With their front wing or nose cone that we saw recently with the floor. It makes a lot of sense given that they're switching to a Mercedes power unit. And with the packaging of the Mercedes power unit, you'd imagine, you can tell already from the way the Mercedes is packaged, which is very different to the way the McLaren currently packages the Renault, they get some very different aero structures coming around the new shape of that car, and it will be a completely new shape. So it would make sense to start to fall more in line with the way that Mercedes operate their aero concept as well. So I can imagine that McLaren will start to fall back in line more towards Mercedes. That's not to say I think they'll go down the route of Racing Point and essentially copying a car. I can't see McLaren doing that, but I do think some of those concepts that Mercedes currently utilise may well see their way onto a McLaren or being developed from that sort of starting point. Let me see. What about Pink Arrow's Aston relationship with Newey? Pink Arrow's Aston relationship. I'm not sure. Don't know anything about it. The Adrian Newey Aston Martin relationship at the moment is purely around the Valkyrie, isn't it? The road car from Aston Martin that he's designed with his team. That's a Red Bull Technologies program. The relationship with Aston Martin and Red Bull will continue all the way through the Valkyrie's program. When the Valkyrie program ends, which it has an end date, I don't know what it is, then all ties with Red Bull come to an end between Red Bull and Aston Martin, and presumably Adrian Newey. There is a possibility that Lawrence Stroll could be scouting around the paddock, trying to pluck the best of everybody from all over the place. But I'm not sure you're going to see Adrian Newey leaving Red Bull, given that he's properly inbuilt in that team. They've almost built that team and that technical department around him. He has a huge amount of control and has had a huge amount of success as well. So I don't think he's ready to give up on that yet. I can't see it personally. Let me see. Fire Up says, does your missus work in F1, Mark? She doesn't, but she used to. That's how we met. She used to work in television for ITV when they were making the F1 broadcast. So that's how we met. So she still works in telly, just not on Formula 1 anymore. Will Alpine just be a toothpaste liveried Renault? Says Justin Lariviere. Yes. whether it's a toothpaste liveried Renault, I don't know. But it will be a Renault. It'll be the same team. It'll be the same car. It's just going to have different paintwork. But they're using it, of course, as a branding exercise to highlight their sub-brand Alpine, which almost nobody knows about. In fact, I think there's only one Alpine car in existence that you can buy today. And they're trying to build on that. And Formula 1 is exactly the place you do that. It's like Mercedes are going to start pushing the AMG brand even more. So it makes total sense from a marketing perspective. I don't think it's going to have any impact at all on the actual Formula 1 team. Alpine Colgate, Josh Smith. Right, let's shuffle it along because we're not getting through many questions here, are we? Here we go. Yorderman, this was a chat. This was from in the chat earlier on. I can only just about see over his question. It's such a long one. Hi, Mark. Again, we see the pattern of Red Bull starting the season relatively poorly and then catching up during the year. What are they doing that leads to such a regular trend? That's a good question because we have sort of seen that and we do see it regularly, don't we? And the kind of answer that I think that sums that one up is that Red Bull design, perhaps the most complicated is the wrong word, but what's the word I'm looking for? Temperamental. They design a car that has huge potential with this really extreme rake between front and rear ride heights. Now, the potential of that massively high rake angle is huge. You can potentially maximise the diffuser much more so than you can on these other cars, even the Mercedes that has a much more flat bottom platform. But the downside of this really high rake concept is that it becomes more unpredictable. You know, that window where the diffuser is operating at its maximum level is very difficult to control because it relies on the car being at a set level or a certain level. It requires the front wing to be within a certain distance of the ground. So as you tip the rear of the car up, of course, the front wing becomes lower and starts to work in ground effect with the racetrack, and the concept relies on those things. So then when the car starts launching over bumps, for example, and again these balloon tyres have a big impact on this, as it goes over curbs, as it hits a bump in the road, of course the springy effect of those huge tyres can actually start to really change that ride height, or that distance between the front wing and the road surface, or the distances between the underside of the car and the racetrack itself. And by that changing, that becoming an unstable platform, you can suddenly lose a huge chunk of the downforce your car's relying on. So when it works, it can be great, but it can fall out of that maximum downforce window relatively easily. Or what I mean is it's not easy to keep it in that maximum downforce zone, whereas a stabled platform car like a Mercedes is much easier to do that because you're not so reliant on so many extreme angles working to get the maximum out of your diffuser. So I think Red Bull develop a car that's so on the edge, that has so much potential, and this is very Adrian Newey, by the way, but of course it can take some time to really get used to that, to get to know it, to get to work out how to draw out the maximum of that. And with so little testing in modern Formula One, that's not an easy thing to do. It maybe can take half a year before they've really got on top of how each particular car works. So yeah, I think that's my answer to your question, is that they design a car looking for the maximum in every area, which, you know, is a very Formula One thing. It's certainly a very Adrian thing to do. But of course, that's never the easiest way to approach racing. And maybe it's not the right way in the modern Formula because of the lack of track testing on track time. Maybe the more sensible approach is, rather than go for absolute maxing it out, maybe the more sensible approach is to go for something a little bit more conservative that you know can deliver you results week in, week out. So, as I say, Adrian doesn't tend to work like that, and I can tell you that from experience. So I think, you know, that's one of these questions that they will be asking themselves, but Adrian's a very stubborn man. And actually, on a similar note, I'm going to just quickly switch to this question here, because Mariano Wallman says, "Hey Mark, is servicing ever considered when designing a new car, or performance is all that matters? And even if changing a small component would require taking the entire car apart, being able to repair a car quickly can be an edge in some situations." So how much practicality goes into the design of a Formula One car over outright performance? And the reason I've just switched to that question is because, again, this comes back to Adrian Newey. And I remember working with Adrian, which was both brilliant and inspirational, but hugely frustrating at the same time, because he had 0% of what he did went into practicality. And in fact, we asked him one day in the garage when I was struggling with a barge board or something, I can't remember, struggling for ages just to get something attached because it was so fiddly, just not easy to get to. It was taking way longer than it should have done. And Adrian just happened to walk past. And I said, "Adrian, come here a sec." I said, "When you're designing these things," I said, "how much as a percentage of the design philosophy goes into, you know, practicality, goes into us being able to actually achieve the job with this thing?" And he went, "0," and walked off. And I mean, he had a little chuckle to himself, but it's true. He's so focused on performance. And I think that comes back to that previous question. Whereas, and it's the same with the MP4 18. Remember that disastrous car for McLaren, that he was so stubborn and he was not going to let that idea go. And in the end, it was a brilliant idea, but it was years ahead of its time and we couldn't make it work. But he was so focused on maximising everything and being revolutionary in every area that it ended up costing us dearly, and the car never ever saw a race. But you know, that's the concept that he works towards, which may well explain some of the early season performances of Red Bull, as opposed to once they get to mid-season and they've really got a handle on it all, got the hang of it. So, so hopefully that might explain it a little bit. Marco, that's a great anecdote. Well, it's true. Adrian is the single most stubborn person that I've ever worked with, I would say. And Ron Dennis takes some beating. But both of those characters were also two of the most inspirational people that I've ever worked with. Because actually, whilst it was a pain in the arse working on a lot of Adrian Newey's cars, you know, I was always inspired by the brilliance and his attitude of pursuing every single detail, no matter how small, looking for brilliance and greatness. And for me, that's what Formula One should be. Because, you know, back in the day when I was racing around with Kimi and we had the V8s and the V10s, you know, we were using a qualifying engine or a race engine, and these engines only had to do one race. So it was everything, it was all or bust. And quite often it was bust. Because every single race weekend we'd bring a new engine, a brand new engine, new design, new update. Because Mercedes were pushing the limits so much, you know, and I when it blew up, it was massively frustrating, and it blew up on a lot of occasions. We did not win the 2005 World Championship with Kimi, probably to some large extent because the engine kept blowing up. And, you know, that's massively frustrating. But on the flip side of that, I was also really proud that we were leaving no stone unturned in pushing the limits of technology, because for me, that's what Formula One should have always been about. So there you go. Hopefully that that answers some of that. There we go. Yes, but Mercedes designers is better, should get top credit. Well, look, no one can argue with what Mercedes have done. They've done an incredible job, and the Mercedes team, right from the top to the very bottom, is brilliant and are the benchmark that everyone else is trying to work towards. So, I mean, what I'm saying about Adrian, he is brilliant, but he's also very frustrating. You can't take anything away from Mercedes. Everybody's chasing Mercedes. So yes, they're doing an incredible job and they deserve all of the credit. What they don't deserve is all the criticism they're getting for making Formula One boring, because that's not their problem. They've been given a set of parameters, a set of rules, the same set of rules everyone's been given. And yeah, they got a huge amount of money, but so have Red Bull, so have Ferrari, by a huge amount. And yet Mercedes have absolutely blitzed it, and nobody else can get even close to them. That tells you how good they are. So there we go. Right, 42 minutes. Doc Producer, is that letting me know? Is that a little reminder? Thanks, mate. Right, let's crack on then. Here we go. Mariano Wallman, a follow-up question to that previous one about the design of a Formula One car. He says, what was the most difficult car that you had to work on during your time in F1? That's a good question, and I think I've probably already answered it, because the MP418 was it. An Adrian Newey special. Luckily, I only ever had to work with it once, and that was at a test. But that was an awful... It was a brilliant car, and it was an awful car. Some of the design concepts on that thing, in years further down the line, things like blown diffusers, you know, which we all know and loved when they came in much more recent times, they featured on the MP418. These were concepts where he was sticking the exhaust through the centre of the floor, blowing it into the diffuser, but we couldn't stop it burning everything. And you know, so the thing set fire, and every time it ever left the garage, it would normally come back burning, and we'd have to meet it without fail every time it came back to the garage with a fire extinguisher. I'm not joking. It had some horrific crashes at the hands of Alex Wirtz, unexplainable crashes. We had all manner of failures. It just did not work at the time, but the concepts behind it, the ideas behind it were brilliant. But hands down, Mariano, that was the worst car, the most difficult car I've ever had to work on. There were elements of others. And I remember an Adrian Newey barge board, one of the early barge boards, which was huge. I forget the year, it must have been early, it must have been 2002, 2003. Huge barge boards on these things where the front suspension wishbone member went through the barge board. Now you'd think you'd have a little slot in it, wouldn't you? So you could slot it over the wishbone, because these things were getting knocked off and chipped all the time. They'd be coming off every 5 minutes, but Adrian would not have a slot cut into that barge board because it represented an aero loss. So it had this tiny little hole just big enough for a wishbone, which meant to fit the barge board, which was a common job, you had to take the suspension member off the car, which was not the work of 5 minutes. Lifting the suspension off the car to slot it through this barge board, as I say, which we change it almost every session, was the most frustrating thing I ever had to do. And he just would not have it. He would not have you cut a little slot in it, which must have been the tiniest little negative impact in terms of aero, but that was his attitude. That was the way he worked. A tiny impact, if it's negative, we don't want it. If we can avoid it, we don't want it. And he's right. Right, there we go. Let me see what else we got here. Okay, Ryan asks this one about Sebastian Vettel. He says, how do you think Seb will perform against a 21-year-old Lance Stroll? Well, good question. And of course, no one can actually know the answer until we see it. I listened, I don't know if you may have heard this, I listened to the Beyond the Grid podcast this morning while I was walking the dog, the Sebastian Vettel one, which I thought was a really good listen, really interesting. So worth checking out if you haven't heard that already. But there's two schools of thought, isn't there? There's one school of thought that says Seb is just past his best. And actually, it's not just in 2020 that he's been struggling, 2019 and other years. He's made a constant stream of mistakes, unforced errors, and he keeps doing it. And you could say that's Seb just changing as a driver, as a person. That's creeping into his character. Or you could say the environment at Ferrari is forcing Seb into a mental state that's then causing a lot of these kind of errors. And for me, that's the one that I think is probably closer to the truth. I think when he comes out of that Ferrari environment and goes into an environment at what will be Aston Martin, that's a much smaller, much younger, fresher, much more dynamic team, far less politics, built out of racers, proper old school racers in the most part. I think that's exactly the kind of environment where Seb could thrive. Of course, we have no idea about the state of their car for next year, but given where we are this year for Racing Point, that car has a huge amount of potential. We're only seeing it on occasions, but with a year's worth of development of that car, which they're getting right now, Seb could be walking into an environment that suits him in a car that's competitive, and I hope that we'll start to see Seb get back to his best again. But it's that cracking under pressure which is perhaps the biggest negative that most people point to. Is that going to change? Is the pressure when he's in the car also impacted by the pressure that he feels from outside the car, from Ferrari, from the Tifosi, from the people within his own organisation, from the media? He's one of those characters, isn't he, that's affected by outside influence, and he's wears his heart on his sleeve. He can't seem to brush off perhaps some emotional triggers like that we've seen in the past. Are those traits going to be dissipated if the only thing he has to focus on is driving a relatively fast car next year? We'll have to wait and see. But I think if you were to pick any environment around the grid and say which one would suit Seb most, I would say it's that Racing Point Aston Martin setup, and we may well get the best opportunity to see Seb come back towards his best. If he can't come back to his best in that environment, then I think we have to take the view, sad so that it would be, that maybe he has lost a little bit of his performance. What do you think? Vettel, married with children, will not take as many risks. Now, there's an argument about this that's, I think there's probably some truth in it, that having children absolutely changes you as a person. Whether it changes the risks you take in a racing car, I don't buy that necessarily, because the risks in modern Formula One are relatively simple, aren't they? They're not that great anymore. Not as great as in previous years, let's say. It's a relatively safe environment today. So I don't buy the argument that he's now got children, so he's now thinking a bit more about his own life, because I don't think most drivers getting into a Formula One car today think twice about worrying about their own safety anymore, because it's almost not a thing. But I do wonder if it can take something away from your preparation for a race. It's almost impossible to come away from a race weekend and have some kind of debrief or start to focus on the next weekend until you get to the racetrack again if you're at home with children. That's not a negative for everybody, but it might be for somebody. Nico Rosberg said to me after winning his World Championship in 2016, one of the reasons he couldn't do it again and the reasons he was retiring was there was no way he could dedicate that much of his life and therefore offload almost all responsibility for his children onto his wife to enable him to focus solely on his Formula One title challenge. So it does have an impact on some people more than others. But I don't know whether that's the reason. I think that's probably a bit extreme to say, but I think next year will be a real telling year for Sebastian Vettel. And in answer to your question, I can see lots of you answering the question for Ryan there. How will Seb get on against Stroll? I think that Seb will absolutely perform very strongly against Lance Stroll. I don't think it'll be an absolute whitewash, because I do honestly believe that Stroll has a certain amount of talent in there. He'll also have an extra year with that car under his belt, which will, be significant. So, I don't think it's going to be an absolute one-sided affair, but I think Seb will get on absolutely fine. I think he'll be pushed by Lance, but I don't think he'll, I don't think it'll be an absolute one-sided mess. I really don't believe that. A new start for Seb means perhaps he could be a title contender for 2022, says Rivlud. Well, that will again all depend on the car, of course. That Aston Martin, as it will be next year, is a great basis for a car, but it's still not a match for the Mercedes, which, unless someone can take a giant step forward with the new regs for 2021, which is a possibility, by the way. We are coming from a relatively standard baseline in which Mercedes are dominating by miles. So you wouldn't expect performance to shift too far from the Mercedes. But there are opportunities with these new floors and new aero regulations coming over the course of next year. So we'll have to wait and see. Would you say the complex turbo hybrids were a step in the wrong direction for F1 as a sport, says Leglaf? I think most of you will agree with that statement. I will say that I think with hindsight, yes, they were. I think they were, but I also think that Formula One has let itself down given that technology that we've currently got is just amazing. And as someone who loves tech in Formula One and loves the tech that we have in Formula One, we should have been shouting from the rooftops about what we've achieved with these power units. So given that we took the decision and we started to use them and we've developed them into something that's unbelievably advanced. And yet the world doesn't know that. The world outside of Formula One has no idea that we are pushing boundaries with these engine technology. And yet, and they should, absolutely they should. It could have put a much more positive spin on this power unit technology. And yet we didn't do that. We missed a massive trick. Having said that, the sport hasn't been as competitive, hasn't been as interesting to most fans since we went into the hybrid era. But I don't blame that necessarily on the power unit. I blame that on the fact that most teams didn't do a good enough job in that area as Mercedes did. I mean, if you'd taken Mercedes out of that entire picture, let's just imagine they weren't in the hybrid era, we might be looking back on this hybrid era and saying, wow, it's great. We might have a much more competitive situation. I know you've got Ferrari and Red Bull at the front, but actually the midfield, if you look at the midfield, at times the midfield's been brilliant. So you can't just blame an uncompetitive era on Formula One's power unit technology. But yes, to answer your question, I don't think it was the right decision. It was a decision taken a long time ago, and at that time there were lots of pointers to say that it did look like a good decision. Many people want to go back to V8s, V10s. It's just not going to happen. So we had to move forward. We took some very brave decisions in really advanced technology, hybrid technology. We just didn't maximise the marketing opportunity off the back of that. The messaging that was done around it simply wasn't good enough. And that comes down to the fault of Formula One and also the teams. Let me see how long we got here. 5 minutes. F1 does not promote itself or its achievement at all, says 4 English Lees. Absolutely, I agree with you. It's not been very good. Things are starting to change, and now that we've got a PR department for the first time in Formula One, you'll start to see different messaging coming out. But we've never had a PR department in the sport, so it's no surprise we haven't had good PR. Do you think Ferrari can sort itself out before 2022? So this is an interesting one. Did we have anything on that? No. So Ferrari have an opportunity next year, as we know, to bring a brand new power unit. That's the last opportunity that they'll have to do that because the regulations around power units get more and more restrictive as we go through 21, 22, 23. By 2023, I think all development stops. They are frozen. So Ferrari have an opportunity next year to bring a new unit, which they have. They've got one under development. You'd have to say, and I think they've even said, it's a big step forward from where they are, but it would be very difficult to take a big step backwards. So they have to take a step forwards. The problem they've got is that what's happened to them this year was such a big step back in that all the development over the last few years has clearly centred around this grey area that they were working towards. Take away that little grey area and all of their conceptual design goes out the window. So you can see from their performance what's happened to them as a result of that, and therefore moving forward for next year, they're almost starting from scratch, aren't they? They're almost starting a design process from a blank sheet of paper, almost. So yes, they can hopefully take a step forward for 2021, but I don't think it's going to be the step forward that's going to take them back to the front of the grid. And therefore, to get to that by 2022 is also going to be really, really tough. Sorry, I know that just flashed off for a moment. Hopefully you have got me back now. It's been a slightly unstable connection tonight, but it's at YouTube's end, I believe. Well, actually, this is my stuff. Hopefully you got me back. I'm going to carry on. We've got 2 minutes left, 5 minutes left rather. So, sorry, I know we've got no picture. Oh, it's gone. Has it gone? It's completely gone. Okay, well, I'll tell you what then. That's probably a good point to end it. Not sure what happened there, guys, but thank you so much for joining. I appreciate it. And I'll see you all next week. Have a good one. Ta-da.